It's such an honour to be here. My absolute favourite teaching in the world is to teach theory with postgraduate students, so this is really a treat for me. I'm just really sorry I can't be here with you all day. So I understand that Sonia talked a bit about shit in her talk. So unbeknownst to me, there is some shit continuity happening in the day. So many of you will no doubt be familiar with the great black philosopher Charles Mills and his path-breaking notion of the racial contract, where he looked at the social contract that theorists had posited as the basis for a free exchange between the sovereign and the liberal subjects, and he argued that in fact that wasn't a free exchange because it was founded on the extraction of the life and labour of black bodies and the erasure of that extraction. In a relatively lesser known essay called Black Trash, Mills comes back to the famous image of the Leviathan that I have up here, the Leviathan being the sovereign that Hobbes had posited as the one that subjects will willingly obey, exchanging freedom for security. And he asks some interesting questions. If he asks, we find the figure of the body politic constituted by the social contract a compelling image, then we might, and I quote, take the metaphor even further and ask about the less respectable organic functions and their corresponding body parts. And from here he asks, and I quote, what about excretion, the lower intestine, the urinary tract, the anus? Now, in a recent essay, the black feminist philosopher Romy Opperman takes Mills's question, and she has a good play with it, focusing on this disavowal of Leviathan's anus and the projection of all that excretion, filth and waste onto those who are already abject, the black. In other words, the Leviathan, presented as the sovereign, cannot have, or at least cannot be seen to have, an anus. Rather, the sovereign is transcendent, self-contained, non-metabolizing and freed from materiality. Like an angel, the sovereign floats above what is messy, giving order and security to all of that material mess. Now, you might be sitting there thinking this is very interesting and provocative, but what on earth has it got to do with theory? So I'm just going to give you a little kind of cut to the chase for my argument. So what I want to put to you, and there are real parallels with Donna Haraway's notion of the view from nowhere here, but I think with a much more material turn, that the dominant image and the dominant practice of theory, at least as it's practiced in the humanities and social sciences, is analogous to the sovereign, transcendent, immaterial, and the source of order, or in cruder terms, without an anus. And I was really excited about the last question that I caught at the end of the previous section about what are the alternatives. I want to suggest that, as we know, not only is this inaccurate, constrained and constraining, it's also ideological and inimical to the type of work that we need theory to be doing in an era of ecological and political violence against human and more than human others who routinely take the shit. But this is not the only available theory. And again, the comment about methodology in the last session, I want to offer another alternative methodology of theory, which I call shit theory. So what do I mean when I say that the dominant image of theory is analogous to the sovereign? So let's start with the root of the term theory. So the word theory comes from the Greek theorem, to see. A theorist is the one who sees. The notion of the theorist initially emerged from the ambassadors who went to distant places in order to separate themselves from what they were immersed in so that they could see clearly other people's rituals and traditions. Now, I want to pull two pieces out of that, the distance and the seeing. As Hannah Arendt observed, From the outset of formal philosophy, thinking has been thought of in terms of seeing. When Socrates suggested that true knowledge involved the journey from the obscurity of the cage out into the light of the sun, he bequeathed a metaphoric world of thinking and knowing as seeing that remains deeply woven into the fabric of our Western practices of theorizing. For Plato, the representative thinker is, quote, a man of sight, and his thinking is thinking with eyes, and it leads to the highest form of knowledge, which he calls theoria. Now, there's way too much to say about this in 15 minutes, but I want to make a few observations about how privileging sight as the metaphor for theorizing and thinking shapes the way in which we assume theory works. And here I'm drawing on Hans Jonas, who pulled out 3 key characteristics. The first is sight's capacity to give the perceiver what he called access to the contemporaneous manifold. Everything appears at once in a single moment. Second is sight's isolation of the object as a thing in itself. So there's you, and there's you, and there's you, and there's the chair. And the third is sight's abstraction of the object of perception in any causal relationship with the perceiver and the establishment of a distance, again, between the object and the perceiver. Now, Jonas contrasts this visual notion of thinking in particular with an alternative knowledge as sound, which is assumed and privileged in many other traditions. And in this vein, he notes that sight, and I quote, gives access to many things juxtaposed as coexistent parts in a single horizon at the same time. In the other senses, a single moment gives us access only to one undifferentiated experience. To gain access to the many parts, one has to extend the experience over time. So, for example, in hearing, any present quality, and this is Jonas, is just a point in a passage of transition. The content is never present as a whole, but always in the making, which he concludes, because for Jonas, sight is the highest form of knowing, is always partial and incomplete. Knowing is seen as sound. So sound may contain several elements simultaneously. So, for example, when an orchestra produces music, but the distinction between the elements, the you and the you and the you, is lost. Whereas when we see many objects at once, we differentiate them into their self-contained parts. Sight's important as a metaphor for knowledge, Jonas goes on to argue, also lies in its relationship with time. Sight alone produces the experience of the present, and I quote, as something more than the point of experience of the passing now, end of quote. And so, whereas time is built into the content of sound, so think for a melody is notes unfolding across time in a sequence, the content of what one sees, for example, the colour of an object, is not in itself affected by how long it lasts. We believe that we can abstract colour independently of time. So Jonas goes a step further, linking vision with the project of metaphysics by noting that it is vision's production of being as essentially static outside time, which gives rise to this ultimate notion that the unmediated truth is something that we find in eternity, outside the flow of time. Theory then, in its heart, is seen as the highest form of this type of knowledge, produced precisely by abstracting itself from all that is fluid, all that is material, and so all of the messiness of the manifold, which is why I love this image, and indeed the passage of time itself as the condition of everything that comes into and goes out of existence. I want to say that again. Time is the condition of everything that goes into and comes out of existence. Like the sovereign, theory's power on this model lies precisely in the capacity to take distance, to draw the essential static truth from the contingency of what is changing, in short, to occupy a place out of the fray, unattached and in control. Now, closer to home, if we think about this in terms of our own research, Theory starts when you leave the field and take distance from the sweat, the sleeplessness, the good relationships, the bad relationships, the upset tummy, the ums and ahs that come through in the conversations that you have, the sense that maybe you're wasting your whole time, that this is all, like, why are you doing this? All that belongs to the realm of the empirical and the contingent. Theory coalesces when you step back into the cool of your office, when you read and you digest everything, and you can now produce syllogisms and interpretations that make sense of it all. Like the sovereign, theory demands that you give up all of the freedoms that come from the to and fro, the messiness of the manifold of life amongst beings who come into and go out of existence. But it promises you the security of knowing. And a chapter in your thesis. Now, I'd like to tell you a different story about theory. And this is a story that I discovered in my own life when I started to discover how a different type of theorising feels. As Sophie and Michael know, about a decade ago, I decided to move out of the city and live on an intentional multi-species community. And I did that for many reasons, but one of the reasons was that I was starting to work on this theory of multi-species justice. And it was evident to me that I couldn't do that with any integrity if I was literally living my life bumping only up against other human beings, and the more than human beings in my life were dominated, as in planted in concrete. It seemed to me that one of the reasons that dominant theories of justice systematically exclude beings other than humans is that the humans who are doing the theorising organise our lives in ways that are profoundly abstracted from these living metabolic relationships with Earth others. So they just don't show up as mattering. So if I was going to theorise otherwise, I needed to place myself in other material relationships. Quite literally, if others were going to have a chance of really mattering to me, we had to be present as matter together. Now, the multi-species community where I live has a lot of other animals and grasses and soils and rivers and forests, and it's located in an incredibly beautiful place. But like so much of this country, the land and those relationships have been damaged by colonial farming practices, in particular dairy farming. And so while it's important to me to offer refuge to many other refugee animals from industrial animal agriculture, there's a great deal of work to be done on regenerating good relations. And most importantly, that happens through composting. So when I am not at my desk theorising, a good deal of my time is spent walking around the land. Initially, when we first got there with a wheelbarrow, and now we have a little electric ATV, all-terrain vehicle, picking up manure, putting it in buckets and dumping it onto a compost pile. And there on this compost pile, my partner has created these pipes that go underneath it that pass hot air, which is heated by the solar panels on our roof, and it grows rich, dark soil or compost tea, which we then spread on the land to nurture the vegetables that we eat, the grasses and trees that the donkeys, horses, pigs, goats, sheep, wombats, and everyone else make and then ship out, and it all goes around again. Now, I love this non-theoretical work because it brings me close to the earth, as well as tracing where everyone has moved in the night before when we are all enveloped in darkness. I love the smell and the feeling of my body in movement, the sound of the birds and the wind, the proximity to everybody else's bodies. Sometimes the composting has a very different feel, like when someone dies and we carry them to bury them into that pile where their body becomes part of the relationships that we call soil and eventually spread back into the land and back into our lives. And then one day, all of this embodied activity started to take the form of thoughts and words. I realised, shifted from being a human who bought food produced in some anonymous place, using machines powered by some anonymous, unknown source of human and more than human energy, to a body literally enmeshed in the metabolism of life and death, growth and decay. This movement, I realised, of the sun that powers the ATV and the heating of the compost, the animals eating and shitting, the mycelium transforming the manure into this beautiful soil, now included not only my body bending and lifting, but also us collectively secreting a theory of multi-species justice. And so I came to, in this very metabolic way, understand that justice entails a very different metabolism, one in which I, as a human, as a body, as a theorist, don't stand aside and look at all of these objects from a distance where I can discern their relationships. Rather, justice is our bodies being in there together amidst the flow, where what shows up are not differentiated components, but they're formative and transformative, generative and decaying relationships. Having done this, and I am somewhere different in my career to many people here, I can tell you that of the two theories, the sovereign theory and the shit theory, I will choose shit theory every time.